Good evening, my friends. The world woke up to headlines dressed like miracles. $3 billion of African debt erased, gone, swept away with the stroke of a pen. In Washington and Paris, anchors smiled and ministers posed for photographs as if history itself had turned merciful overnight. Cameras spoke of gifts of opportunity, of hope. To the West it was triumph. To the screens it was charity. But in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not smile. He leaned forward, clenched his fist, and whispered a sentence that cut through the noise. Behind their smiles there is always a trap. In that instant he stood apart, not as a skeptic, but as a man who remembered. For Africa has been here before. From colonial treaties to structural adjustment, every promise of relief has come wrapped in chains. What does it mean to cancel debt if the price is gold, oil, and uranium, the very lifeblood of a continent? What is freedom worth when the ink of a contract can mortgage generations yet unborn? Tonight we ask the harder question. Did the IMF truly forgive Africa's burdens, or did it sign a new chapter of dependency? And more urgently, what did Captain Traoré see hidden in the fine print that the world chose to ignore? The announcement came like thunder on a clear day. The International Monetary Fund, long known as the strict collector of Africa's debts, suddenly appeared as a benefactor. $3 billion erased overnight, a gesture hailed as generosity. News anchors in New York called it a turning point. Politicians in Paris spoke of a new partnership. Across Europe, headlines framed it as the dawn of equality between North and South. Yet for anyone who has lived through Africa's financial history, such a declaration did not feel new. It felt familiar, dangerously familiar. Since the 1980s, when austerity became the condition for every loan, African nations have carried the scars of IMF policies. Hospitals stripped of medicine, schools without teachers, governments forced to cut public wages while still paying foreign creditors on time. ActionAid, a global watchdog, recently showed that in countries from Ghana to Malawi, the IMF still presses for wage freezes and spending cuts. 8 out of 10 African nations under IMF advice have been told to tighten belts so much that their public services crumble. That is not charity. That is control. And so when the IMF suddenly played the role of savior, many celebrated. But one man did not. In the capital of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat with his advisors, listening carefully to the fine print. For in the financial world, the danger rarely lies in what is announced. It lies in what is hidden between the lines. The phrase was debt relief. Yet buried beneath were clauses that demanded repayment, not in dollars, but in resources, collateral secured by gold reserves, oil wells, and uranium mines. Imagine a nation whose debts are forgiven only to discover that 40% of its future oil revenues have already been signed away. Picture a treasury celebrating freedom while 25 tons of gold worth nearly $2 billion stand pledged to foreign creditors at a fraction of their true value. This was not generosity. It was repossession dressed in the robes of compassion. Burkina Faso knew too well the price of such promises. In the 1970s, when international lenders encouraged loans for infrastructure, those loans turned into chains as soon as commodity prices shifted. In the 1990s, structural adjustment programs forced African countries to privatize, liberalize, and open markets. The result was often the sale of state assets to foreign companies for pennies. Sovereignty lost not in battlefields but in boardrooms. Traoré remembered. And memory in politics is sometimes more dangerous than resistance. For where others saw a windfall, he saw a trap repeating itself. His refusal to sign was not born of cynicism. It was born of history. And the contrast was striking. Western leaders posed for cameras calling it mercy. But in Ouagadougou, silence was louder than applause. One leader standing in a small landlocked nation refused to lift his pen. The question now burned across the continent. Why would a soldier president reject a gift the world was praising? Did he see something that others ignored? Or was he about to drag his country into isolation? The applause was deafening abroad. But in Africa's streets, whispers grew. Could it be that what the IMF offered was not relief, but another name for chains? When the cameras dimmed and the applause faded, Captain Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that startled even his closest allies. He would not simply refuse the IMF's gift, he would investigate it. In the quiet corridors of Ouagadougou, away from microphones and ceremonies, he summoned a handful of trusted men and women, economists, auditors, intelligence officers. Their task was clear but dangerous: to uncover what lay beneath the smiling promises of debt relief. This was no ordinary committee. It was a war cabinet dressed in civilian clothes. By day they blended into government ministries. By night they gathered in dimly lit rooms, poring over contracts line by line. They traced bank transfers through offshore accounts in Luxembourg and Geneva. They compared the IMF's clauses with colonial treaties from a century ago. What they found chilled them to the bone. The empire had not ended. It had simply changed its uniform. Among the stacks of documents, one folder stood out. Stamped with the words, Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Program, it bore the signatures of consultants linked to powerful circles in Washington. The contents were explosive. The plan envisioned a new digital dollar designed to rival China's fast-rising digital yuan. But instead of being backed by innovation or domestic wealth, this currency would be anchored to Africa's resources: gold, oil, uranium. The very soil of the Sahel was penciled into America's blueprint for financial supremacy. The details were cold arithmetic. 5 African nations alone could underpin $500 billion of digital issuance. Burkina Faso's uranium reserves valued at over $2.7 billion in U.S. markets were marked as strategic stabilizers. Gold reserves across the Sahel were listed line by line, totaling nearly 600 metric tons, assets worth more than $40 billion. To Washington's advisors, Africa was not a partner. It was collateral. For Traoré, the discovery was vindication and alarm at once. Vindication because his suspicions had been confirmed. This was not relief but repossession. Alarm because the stakes were far larger than Burkina Faso. If the Phoenix dollar came to life, every ounce of African gold, every barrel of oil, every gram of uranium would no longer serve local economies. They would feed a digital empire designed thousands of miles away, weaponized against Beijing, invisible to the very people whose land carried the burden. The moment was a revelation. Debt relief had always carried conditions, but this was different. It was not about repayment schedules or interest rates. It was about transforming a continent into the collateral foundation of someone else's war. Soldiers had once marched across Africa to seize land. Now bankers marched across spreadsheets to seize value. Neocolonialism no longer wore boots. It wore contracts. In that secret chamber, one question echoed louder than the rest. Could Africa afford to let its soil become the battlefield of giants once again? Traoré clenched his fist. He had his answer. The trap had been uncovered. But exposing it would demand courage of another kind. For to challenge the IMF and Washington was to stand against the architecture of global finance itself. The risk was isolation. The reward perhaps a chance at true sovereignty. And so while Western headlines praised generosity, Ouagadougou prepared for confrontation. The stage was set. The question now was not whether the trap existed, it was whether Africa dared to break it before it snapped shut. The revelation spread first in whispers. A handful of journalists in Ouagadougou caught wind of the investigation. Economists close to the presidency hinted that debt relief might not be what it seemed. Then the whispers grew into debates across the continent. In Dakar, students packed lecture halls dissecting the contracts clause by clause. Was this really debt forgiveness or merely a pawnshop transaction, trading futures for a clean balance sheet? In Lagos, newspapers published biting editorials comparing the IMF's promises to chains wrapped in ribbon. Radio call-ins buzzed with anger. One caller from Nairobi declared, "This is not relief. This is repossession." Western media painted a very different picture. In New York and London, columnists labeled Ibrahim Traoré a reckless populist, a soldier out of his depth. They said he was sabotaging Africa's chance at integration into the global economy. Parisian networks went further, branding him anti-investment and hostile to development. But every attempt at character assassination only fueled the fire. Because for every insult published abroad, African citizens had already seen the evidence with their own eyes. In the villages of Burkina Faso, the debate was not about economics, it was about survival. An old farmer, his hands calloused from decades of tilling the soil, told a crowd, "I would rather my children inherit debt than inherit slavery disguised as relief." The words cut deeper than any speech. They traveled across languages, across borders, turning into a rallying cry repeated in markets and classrooms and protests. Real-world context made the warning sharper. Ethiopia, burdened by external bonds, was struggling under the weight of IMF conditions. In Senegal, a credit program worth nearly $2 billion was suspended after officials misreported debt levels, leaving the country scrambling. Across the continent, governments had cut public wages and subsidies to appease creditors, even as hospitals and schools withered. Citizens did not need to imagine the cost of IMF generosity, they were already living it. Soon the conversation moved from cafes to the streets. In Bamako, placards read, "Our resources are not for sale." In Niamey, students marched under banners declaring no to Phoenix dollar. Social media ignited. Hashtags in French, English, and local dialects swept across the continent. Not relief, but robbery, our gold, our future. Memes mocked the idea of a gift that stole futures. The irony was sharp. Western governments thought debt relief would buy goodwill. Instead, it bought suspicion, debate, and defiance. And then came the moment everyone feared yet anticipated. Captain Ibrahim Traoré decided the whispers and debates were not enough. The truth had to be spoken aloud, not in closed circles, not in coded language, but in the open. He would go public. The world had applauded debt forgiveness. Now it would hear the hidden cost. The decision came not in secret but in daylight. One evening, state television interrupted its usual broadcast. Instead of music or ceremony, the screen showed Captain Ibrahim Traoré seated at a table piled with folders marked in red ink. His voice was steady, deliberate. He began to read line by line the clauses that had been hidden from ordinary eyes. "This is not debt relief," he declared. "This is collateral. Gold, oil, uranium, our lifeblood traded away at discounts written in fine print." On the screen, graphics unfolded. Charts compared global gold prices, $2,450 an ounce in New York, against the discounted rates. African nations were forced to accept sometimes as low as $1,650. Barrels of oil sold worldwide at $75, mortgaged away for barely $50. Teachers, farmers, traders watching in their homes gasped. For once, the jargon of finance had been stripped bare. It was no longer numbers. It was theft translated into everyday language. Traoré's strategy was daring. He knew that exposing contracts in parliament would be ignored, that appealing to global institutions would be dismissed. But placing the evidence in the hands of citizens turned numbers into a weapon. University students received copies of the documents, fueling lectures and late-night debates about sovereignty. Villagers in Kaya gathered around projectors where simple infographics compared relief with resources lost. Even markets in Ouagadougou echoed with conversations about the Phoenix dollar as traders explained to each other how future uranium had been pledged for pennies. The effect was electric. Skepticism hardened into certainty. Rumor became fact. Across Africa, people who once shrugged at international finance became witnesses to a scheme laid bare. Devex had already reported that 6 African countries, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Malawi, Nigeria, spent more on debt service than on health or education. Now those grim statistics had to face a contract and a culprit. For the first time in a generation, the narrative shifted. The IMF was not seen as savior, but as creditor dressed as benefactor. Debt relief no longer sounded like freedom, it sounded like repossession. And the ripple effects came quickly. Civil society groups organized town halls, radio stations dedicated hours to dissecting clauses. Religious leaders delivered sermons comparing the IMF's generosity to Judas's silver. Ordinary citizens began asking questions usually reserved for economists. If our gold backs their dollar, what backs our independence? The victory was not measured in money. Burkina Faso still faced shortages and debts, but by choosing transparency, Traoré broke the cycle of secrecy. Knowledge had become resistance. And yet everyone knew the cost of such defiance. For every clause read aloud, for every chart broadcast, enemies gathered. Western media sharpened its attacks. Washington prepared its counterstrike. The truth was out. But could truth alone protect a small nation from the storm it had just unleashed? The backlash came fast. Within hours of Traoré's televised disclosure, the International Monetary Fund issued a statement. It was firm, almost paternal. The documents had been misinterpreted. No resources had ever been demanded. Africa was merely being offered innovative debt solutions. But the denial fell flat. Citizens had already seen the contracts with their own eyes. The words of press releases could not erase signatures on paper. In Washington, the reaction was sharper. Former President Donald Trump appeared on television, his voice raised. He dismissed Traoré as a radical soldier out of his depth, accusing him of sabotaging Africa's chance at prosperity. American networks echoed his lines. Editorials in the New York Times and the Financial Times warned of a populist strongman jeopardizing economic stability. French broadcasters went further, describing Traoré as hostile to investment, a reckless figure dragging his nation toward isolation. Yet behind closed doors, concern ran deeper. Financial analysts in New York calculated the risks. If African nations began rejecting IMF contracts, gold and uranium supplies could tighten threatening funds worth hundreds of billions. In Brussels, a leaked memo captured the unease in chilling words, "Africans caught us." But while Western capitals scrambled to control the narrative, the story took a different tone elsewhere. In Beijing and Moscow, the revelations were watched with interest. The BRICS bloc, already positioning itself as an alternative to Western finance, saw opportunity. Commentators in Chinese state media framed Traoré's defiance as proof that Africa was ready to break free from Western dominance. Russian outlets compared the IMF contracts to colonial-era treaties, calling them financial occupation. In New Delhi, op-eds speculated that a multipolar world was emerging, one where Africa could tilt the balance. For Africa, the historical echoes were impossible to ignore. Haiti in the 19th century, forced to pay reparations for daring to declare independence. Congo in the 20th century, stripped of its copper and rubber while foreign companies grew rich. And now in the 21st century, a digital empire proposed to rise on the back of African gold and oil. The methods had changed, but the outcome was the same: sovereignty mortgaged, futures sold. The comparison stung. Citizens remembered that when independence was won in the 1960s, they were told the battle was political. Few realized the next battle would be financial. Chains could be forged not only of iron but of contracts, and once signed they could bind just as tightly. Meanwhile, BRICS nations began sending quiet signals. Russian diplomats hinted at technical support for countries rejecting IMF terms. China offered talks on resource-backed loans under mutual partnership, a subtle jab at Washington's model. Even Brazil and South Africa, though more cautious, praised Traoré's courage publicly. The West called it isolation. Africa began to call it alignment. And yet the stakes were high. Refusing the IMF was not a symbolic act. It risked sanctions, frozen assets, and restricted markets. Washington had the microphones of global media. Traoré had the numbers. The question hung heavy: whose story would prevail? It was here that the challenge turned personal for every listener. For if debt could be forgiven at the cost of sovereignty, what would you choose: comfort today or dignity tomorrow? The streets spoke louder than any headline. In Ouagadougou, thousands poured into the boulevards, carrying placards scrawled with words that shook the air: better hungry and free than full in chains. The phrase spread like wildfire, whispered first in villages, then shouted in capitals, until it became the anthem of defiance. In Bamako, students marched with painted bowls of empty rice, symbols of what they refused to trade away. In Niamey, demonstrators carried mock contracts torn and burned in public squares. In Lagos, journalists hosted live debates dissecting IMF clauses line by line, transforming complex jargon into everyday language. And in Johannesburg, protest banners appeared outside financial institutions, accused of brokering the deals. Social media amplified the uprising. Short videos explained how a barrel of African oil worth $75 globally was being mortgaged away at $50. Memes mocked the phrase debt relief with images of golden chains. Hashtags in French, English, Hausa, and Swahili lit up feeds: our gold, our future, not relief but robbery, Phoenix trap. This was no longer the voice of one soldier president. It had become a chorus across the continent. Citizens who once dismissed finance as distant now claimed ownership of the conversation. A taxi driver in Ouagadougou captured the mood in one viral clip: if they deny the contracts, why don't they show us the clean version? Why only words, never papers? The question needed no answer. The political consequences were immediate. The Sahel Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger tightened ranks. In a joint communiqué, they condemned IMF contracts as resource mortgages and pledged to defend one another against retaliation. Ministers met in secret, sketching alternatives, pooling gold reserves, negotiating directly with BRICS, even exploring blockchain systems to secure trade independent of the West. Alone, each nation risked being crushed. Together, they held leverage. Meanwhile, reality gave their defiance weight. Senegal had already faced IMF scrutiny after misreporting debt, losing access to a $1.8 billion credit line. Ghana and Zambia struggled under repayment schedules that starved their health systems. Citizens across Africa recognized their own struggles in Traoré's warning. His fight was not just Burkina Faso's, it was theirs. The atmosphere was electric but tense. Western embassies reported swelling protests outside their gates. Placards bore blunt truths: our uranium is not for your lights. Our gold is not your collateral. Crowds chanted late into the night, fueled not by ideology, but by memory. Memory of broken promises. Memory of chains disguised as gifts. This was more than politics. It was the rebirth of a continent's consciousness. For decades, Africa had been told its strength lay in resources. Now it discovered a greater resource: unity. But as crowds marched and leaders aligned, another question loomed like a storm cloud. Could unity hold when the weight of sanctions, markets, and isolation pressed down? Or would the fire of defiance burn out under the cold machinery of global finance? One by one, the dominoes began to fall. Niger, citing unacceptable conditions tied to uranium revenues, suspended its participation. Days later, Mali declared that its gold would never again serve as collateral for foreign loans. By October, even Nigeria and South Africa, economic heavyweights, announced formal reviews of their IMF agreements, spurred by the revelations from Ouagadougou. What had been paraded as a $3 billion triumph was collapsing like a house of cards. Markets trembled. In New York, gold futures surged past $2,600 an ounce as traders feared Africa would withhold supply. In Paris, uranium contracts spiked 18% in a week, threatening Europe's nuclear energy stability. Oil traders in London began adding risk premiums, worried that Sahel producers might redirect barrels toward Asian buyers. Analysts calculated that if just 4 African countries withheld participation, Western economies could face disruptions worth more than $20 billion annually. Washington responded with fury. Former President Trump thundered that sanctions, asset freezes, and export restrictions were now on the table. His words were sharp. If they don't want relief, they will feel the consequences. But his threats backfired. Across Africa, chants of better hungry and free than full in chains grew louder. What was meant to intimidate instead became a rallying cry. Meanwhile, the IMF scrambled. Revised contracts were drafted with softer language, but citizens had already read the fine print once. Trust once broken could not be repaired with cosmetics. Even governments that had initially signed began backing away under public pressure. Ghana launched a parliamentary inquiry into IMF deals. Kenya announced a review of all resource-backed commitments. The tide was irreversible. Commentators in New York began whispering a word rarely linked to Africa: precedent. For the first time, a coordinated refusal had forced the IMF into retreat. Hedge fund managers nervously speculated whether Latin America or Southeast Asia might follow the same path. If debt relief could no longer be wielded as leverage, what tools remained for global finance to hold its grip? And yet, beyond the markets and memos, the deeper question was human. Could Africa sustain the sacrifice it had chosen? Sanctions would bite, shortages would follow. The daily lives of farmers, traders, teachers would grow harder. But in that hardship lay a rare prize: dignity unbroken. If hunger and freedom are better than fullness and chains, then the future of Africa is no longer measured in dollars erased, but in the courage to say no. The gamble was immense. But for the first time in a generation, it was Africa placing the bet, not being played. The storm had begun. The question now was simple. Could this defiance mark not just resistance, but the rebirth of a continent? The climax arrived in Bamako. Under bright lights and watchful cameras, leaders of the Sahel Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, stood shoulder to shoulder. The hall was packed with ministers, civil society leaders, and young activists who had traveled days to witness history. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped to the podium, silence swept across the room. His words were measured, but they struck like thunder. Alone they can sanction us, but united they cannot break us. The hall erupted. For the first time in decades, Africa was not fragmented into bargaining tables. It was speaking with one voice. The summit ended with a declaration: no more resource-backed IMF contracts, no more mortgaging of futures. Gold, oil, and uranium would no longer be pawned for temporary relief. The symbolism was powerful. For generations, Africa had been told to beg for forgiveness, to accept crumbs dressed as generosity. Now it was setting terms. With reserves worth tens of billions, it was no longer a debtor pleading for mercy, but a bloc capable of reshaping global finance. Yet the victory was not measured in markets. Burkina Faso still faced shortages, its people still labored under hardship. But within that struggle lay the triumph. True sovereignty is not written in erased debts, but in the courage to refuse when refusal is just. By standing together, the Sahel nations proved that Africa's greatest resource is not underground. It is within its people, the will to defend their future. Some whispered it was rumor, others swore it was truth. Yet whether fact or fable, it entered the hearts of millions as history itself. Because in the end, freedom is not granted. It is claimed. And now, my friends, the question turns to you. What lessons can your nation learn from this stand? Is dignity worth more than comfort? Can sovereignty be reclaimed, not gifted? If this story moved you, save this video, share it, and join the debate below. Write one word in the comments: dignity, freedom, or chains, because freedom once spoken aloud must echo until no one can silence it.